more. But yeah, this is really great questions. All right, so the primordial nature of God, let's think about it a little bit more. So the ultimate ground of possibility, order, value, actuality, okay? And Whitehead said they're like the Platonic realm of forms, okay? Remember, so they're akin, but they're also different from these forms. So Whitehead's making a theological move here, though, okay? And it's a move that the wisdom of the theological tradition has made before, okay? Augustine made it, Aquinas made it, many others. They face the reality of Platonic-like ideas or forms that have to be there in some sense. And they're necessary, but are they rivals to God? Are they God themselves, an independent God in some sense? The tradition said no. Actually, they didn't say they exist independently on their own, but they subsist, the language of subsistence. They subsist in actuality. Okay? And this actuality, according to the tradition, Whitehead tends to follow this in an important way, but in his own unique system, is the mind of God. Possibilities in some sense are divine stuff, divine mind stuff. It's hard to think about, but think about your relation to possibilities. The possibilities you think about and you contemplate belong to the mental dimension of yourself. Now, what about those possibilities that you are? You certainly couldn't contemplate them before you existed, so where were they? Where are those infinite possibilities that we have never even conceived of, but are there? Whitehead says they belong to the primordial mind of God. And it's something about the actuality of this mind, remember the actuality of it, the ontological principle, which gives them existence, gives them efficacy, gives them relevance for the world process in each moment. Okay, and he calls this dimension of God non-temporal, and I sort of made that point, precisely because it's the ground of eternal possibility. Right? There's a dimension of God that is completely unchanging. It's that dimension of God that is infinitely possible. God is the ground of the possible. And the language Whitehead uses here is the unlimited conceptual realization of the absolute wealth of potentiality. That's a great statement. Okay, so God is primordial. We're talking about the primordial side of God. Remember, it's not two gods. It's two domains or dimensions or levels of being within the one life of God. So God in this primordial nature is the presupposed reason. The reason why eternal possibilities are relevant to the world process in every moment. Okay, God, he says, is the unconditioned actuality of conceptual feeling at the base of things, so that by reason of this primordial actuality, there's an order in the relevance of eternal objects to the process of creation. Now you're beginning to see God's role for the world process. It's not at all trivial, okay? The final entity, I'll read this one, is the divine element in the world, by which the barren, insufficient disjunction of abstract potentialities obtains primordially the efficient conjunction of ideal realization. This ideal realization of potentialities in a primordial actual entity constitutes the metaphysical stability, whereby the actual process exemplifies general principles of metaphysics and attains the ends proper to specific types of emergent order. By reason of the actuality of this primordial valuation of pure potentials, each eternal object has a definite effective relevance to each concrescent process. Right? This is what some of you are getting at. Apart from such orderings, there'd be a complete disjunction of eternal possibilities, unrealized in the temporal world. Novelty would be meaningless and inconceivable. Okay, so it's really a mouthful in a lot of ways. So it's not a trivial function for God. What he's saying is that without this divine valuation, this appetitive sort of ordering of possibility, the whole world would halt in disjointed stagnation. In other words, without God, there would be no novelty at all. Nothing new would ever happen. Right? God is so related to every event and feeding it with the possible that without this function of God, nothing new could happen. Okay? And yet new things have happened. Right? Now, we need to bring in this element of value because we've just used the language of, Whitehead has at least, the language of valuation. That possibilities are not just vacuous, right? In God's nature, they're possibilities of value. They're gifted to the world in every moment. They're evaluated as, in terms of a standard of value in God's nature. Part of what God's nature does is evaluate what can be in terms of value. Okay, so God grounds, he stimulates in a deep sense the emergent of every occasion. The emergence of each occasion as a process of value attainment. Okay, God feeds into every event God's opinion, if you want. That's not the right term. God's choice, God's offering. It's an offering, if you want. You could even use the language of gift here, right? And what is the standard of value? Well, for Whitehead, it's God's own life. God's existence, he says, is founded on value, on ideals of perfection, moral and aesthetic. Remember Whitehead's praise of the aesthetic dimension. He says that God in this primordial nature is characterized by necessary goodness, such that it belongs to the very nature of the divine to divide the good from the evil, right? In this sense, God is limited. God is a definite something. God's limitation is God's goodness. Okay, this is hard stuff because we face the issue of what's the nature of divine necessity? The tradition has always said that for God to be necessary means that God cannot not exist. God is eternal. It doesn't tell us what the nature of that necessity is. One of the great claims of the tradition, and I brought this out in the book I showed you yesterday a little bit, is that necessity can be framed in terms of goodness. There's something about supreme value in the universe that necessarily is. Okay, we're not going to spend too much time on that. It's a hard point of theology. Okay, this is all to say that for Whitehead, God's nature is good. Okay, and God in every moment draws from this beatitude of the divine nature to greet the world with possibilities of goodness, not possibilities of evil. God is limited by good. So God presents the world with possibilities of goodness. I'll read this one too, just because it's another mouthful. Okay, but this gets to these points in a significant way. Okay, God, who is the ground antecedent to transition, right? What must be taken into account before a process even begins, must include all possibilities of physical value conceptually, thereby holding the ideal forms apart in equal conceptual realization of knowledge. Thus, as concepts, they are grasped together in the synthesis of omniscience, right? This is a theological term. He is complete in the sense that his vision determines every possibility of value. Such a complete vision coordinates and adjusts every detail of the world process. This ideal world of conceptual harmonization is merely a description of God himself. Thus, the nature of God is the complete conceptual realization of the realm of ideal forms, the realm of ideal possibilities. The kingdom of heaven is God, but these forms are not realized by him in mere bare isolation, but as elements in the value of his conceptual experience. Also, the ideal forms are in God's vision as contributing to his complete experience by reason of his conceptual realization of their possibilities as value, or as elements of value in any creature. We don't need to exegete the whole thing, but we're getting at that these possibilities of value in a deep sense are a description of what God is and what God's function for the world is. I love this language of adjusting, coordinating and adjusting every detail of the world process. Okay, this isn't a coercive thing. God is not determining what's happening in every single moment. But God is flooding through his own life of possibilities and giving to the world those possibilities that can be achieved in terms of their value. Okay, let me do one more. I know this is a lot. The initial stage of an event's aim is an endowment, which the subject inherits, the event inherits from the inevitable ordering of things, conceptually realized in the nature of God. The immediacy of the concrescent subject, the becoming subject, is constituted by its living aim at its own constitution. Thus, the initial stage of the aim is rooted in the nature of God, and its completion depends upon the self-causation of the subject. God is that actual entity from which each temporal concrescence, each event, becoming event, receives that initial aim from which its own self-creation starts. The transition of the creativity from an actual world to the correlate novel concrescence is conditioned by the relevance of God's all-embracing conceptual valuation to the particular possibilities of transmission from the actual world, and by its relevance to the various possibilities available for initial feelings. It's a complicated statement, Whitehead. the important point is God is what feeds the possibility which inaugurates an event. Right? God gives an initial aim to an event in a deep way. And this event, at its best, can take that aim and actualize it. This aim is an aim